Montana Territory, 1,892. Silas McCrae rode into Dawson Junction, expecting to buy cattle feed and hire seasonal hands. What he found instead changed everything. On the town's dusty main street, a dying widow was auctioning off her last possessions to pay for medicine that wouldn't save her. Among the items up for bid was something that made Silas's blood run cold: guardianship of her 11-year-old granddaughter, Mercy. The girl stood silent and hollow-eyed as men called out prices like she was livestock. When the saloon keeper bid high for cheap labor, Silas knew he couldn't walk away. He'd buried his own son decades ago and sworn never to open his heart again. But some choices define a man's soul. Could a hardened cattle baron and a wounded child who'd lost her voice to trauma somehow heal each other's deepest scars? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wagon wheels carved deep ruts through the prairie mud as Silas McCrae guided his team along the familiar path toward Cottonwood Range. Behind him, wrapped in his spare coat and clutching a small burlap sack that held her entire world, sat the girl he'd just purchased the guardianship of for $200 more money than most folks in Dawson Junction saw in a year. Mercy sat rigid as carved stone, her dark eyes fixed on the endless grassland rolling past them. She hadn't spoken a word since the auction, hadn't even nodded when he'd asked if she was cold or hungry. The silence stretched between them like a chasm neither knew how to cross. Silas had lived with silence for 20 years, ever since the fever took his boy Thomas and his wife Sarah, followed 6 months later, from what the doctor called a broken heart. He'd grown comfortable with quiet evenings, meals eaten alone, conversations limited to necessary ranch business with his hands. But this was different. This silence carried weight, the terrible, pressing weight of a child's unspoken grief. The late afternoon sun painted the Montana sky in shades of amber and rose as they crested the hill that revealed Cottonwood Range spread out below them. 15,000 acres of some of the finest grazing land in the territory, crossed by 3 streams and dotted with groves of cottonwood trees that had given the ranch its name. The main house sat in a natural hollow, protected from winter winds by rolling hills and surrounded by outbuildings that spoke of prosperity earned through decades of hard work. Mercy's posture shifted slightly, and Silas caught her eyes widening as she took in the scope of his holdings. The barn alone was larger than most homes in town, its red paint still bright despite years of weather. Corrals stretched in neat lines, filled with prime breeding stock. The bunkhouse could sleep 12 hands comfortably, though he rarely needed more than 6 outside of roundup season. "Been building this place for near 30 years, Silas said quietly, more to fill the silence than because he expected an answer. "Started with nothing but a land claim, and more hope than sense. My late wife Sarah, she had dreams for this place. Wanted to fill it with children and laughter." He paused, throat tightening around words that had been locked away too long. "Suppose it's been too quiet since she passed." Mercy turned her head slightly toward him, the first sign of interest she'd shown since leaving town. Her small face was pale beneath the prairie dust, framed by brown hair that someone had braided neatly but showed signs of days without proper care. She couldn't weigh more than 70 pounds, soaking wet, all sharp angles and hollow spaces where childhood should have filled her out. As they approached the ranch gate, Silas felt a familiar surge of pride, mixed with melancholy. The entrance stood 12 feet high, built from cottonwood logs and bearing a carved sign that read, "McCrae, Cottonwood Range, STB 1862. Sarah had designed that sign herself, insisting their name should welcome visitors properly. Now it seemed to loom over the small girl beside him, another reminder of all the dreams this place had held and lost. Buck Morrison emerged from the barn as they pulled up to the main house, his weathered face creased with curiosity. The ranch foreman had worked for Silas for 15 years, a steady man in his 40s who'd never asked too many questions, but always seemed to know what needed doing. His eyes took in Mercy with the careful assessment of a man who'd seen his share of hardship. "Boss," Buck nodded, then tipped his hat to Mercy. "Miss." Silas climbed down from the wagon and moved to help Mercy, but she'd already scrambled down on her own, clutching her burlap sack like a shield against her chest. She stood close to the wagon wheel, as if ready to climb back up and flee at the first sign of danger. "Buck, this is Mercy," Silas said, his voice carrying the weight of explanation he wasn't ready to give. "She'll be staying with us, permanently." If Buck was surprised, he didn't show it beyond a slight raising of his eyebrows. "Ma'am," he said to Mercy, his tone gentle. "Welcome to Cottonwood Range." Mercy's eyes darted between the two men, then swept across the ranch buildings with the careful attention of someone mapping escape routes. Silas recognized the look he'd worn it himself during his first weeks in the territory, when every shadow might hide a threat and trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Rosa Delgado appeared in the doorway of the main house, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. The housekeeper had been with the family since before Thomas was born, a woman whose warm heart more than made up for her limited English. Her dark eyes went wide when she saw Mercy, and without hesitation, she stepped forward with the maternal instincts that had made her indispensable to the McCrae household. "Dios mío," she murmured, taking in Mercy's thin frame and hollow expression. "The poor niña, she is so small." "Rosa, this is Mercy," Silas said. "She'll need a room prepared, and probably a good meal. I imagine it's been a while since she's eaten properly." Rosa nodded vigorously and began speaking in rapid Spanish, her hands gesturing expressively as she switched between languages. "Sí, of course, the blue room, it has the morning sun. Very pretty for a young girl. And I have fresh bread and soup with beef. She needs meat on her bones. This one." Mercy watched Rosa with fascination, perhaps grateful for the woman's animated chatter that required no response. When Rosa extended a gentle hand toward her, Mercy hesitated only a moment before allowing herself to be guided toward the house. The main house reflected Sarah's influence in every detail, from the wide front porch, designed for evening conversations, to the carefully tended flower boxes that Buck maintained in her memory. Inside, the rooms were spacious but comfortable, furnished with pieces Silas and Sarah had selected together during their early years, when every dollar had been precious and every purchase carefully considered. The parlor still held Sarah's piano, though it hadn't been played since her death. Thomas's books lined the shelves, adventure stories and poetry that had fired a young boy's imagination. Family photographs sat on the mantelpiece, frozen moments of happiness that now seemed impossibly distant. Mercy's eyes moved over everything with the careful attention of someone cataloguing her surroundings. She paused at the family photographs, her head tilting slightly as she studied the images of Thomas at various ages, a gap-toothed smile at 7, proud and serious at 15, the last formal portrait taken just months before the fever struck. "That's my son Thomas," Silas said quietly. "He'd be about 30 now if—" He stopped, the familiar tightness gripping his chest. He loved this place. Always said he'd raise his own children here someday. Mercy looked up at him then, her dark eyes holding depths that seemed too ancient for her young face. For a moment, Silas thought she might speak, but Rosa's return with a laden tray broke the spell. "Come, mija," Rosa said, settling the tray on the kitchen table. "You must eat. Growing girls need good food, and Rosa's soup will put color in those pale cheeks." The kitchen was the heart of the house, with a massive wood-burning stove that Rosa ruled like a general commanding troops. The long table had hosted countless meals for ranch hands and visiting neighbors, but tonight it seemed cavernous with only 3 people around it. Mercy ate slowly, carefully, as if good food might disappear if she drew attention to herself. She finished every drop of soup and accepted a second helping without being asked, her small hands wrapped around the warm bowl like it was precious treasure. "The room is ready," Rosa announced when Mercy had finished eating. "Clean sheets, fresh water for washing, and I put extra blankets. The nights grow cold now." Silas watched Mercy's face for any sign of what she was thinking or feeling, but she remained as unreadable as still water. When Rosa led her upstairs, she went without protest, but without enthusiasm, carrying her small sack and following like a shadow. Alone in his kitchen, Silas sat heavily in his chair and stared at the empty bowl that marked Mercy's first meal at Cottonwood Range. What had he done? In a moment of moral outrage, he'd taken responsibility for a traumatized child he knew nothing about. He had no experience with young girls, no understanding of what she needed beyond food and shelter. The house settled around him with familiar creaks and sighs, sounds that had comforted him through 20 years of solitude. But tonight they seemed different, charged with the presence of another soul under his roof. Somewhere upstairs, a child was lying in a strange bed, surrounded by the belongings of people she'd never known, in the care of a man who'd sworn never to risk his heart again. Through the kitchen window, he could see Buck moving among the corrals, checking the stock with his usual thoroughness. The normal rhythms of ranch life continued, but Silas knew that everything had changed. The girl upstairs represented more than just another mouth to feed or responsibility to shoulder. She was a living reminder that some choices, once made, transform everything that comes after. As darkness settled over Cottonwood Range, Silas climbed the stairs to check on his unexpected ward. The blue room's door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap he could see Mercy sitting on the bed, still fully dressed, clutching her burlap sack. She stared out the window at the star-filled sky, her profile etched against the moonlight streaming through the glass. He wanted to speak, to offer some word of comfort or reassurance. But what could he say? That everything would be all right? That she was safe now? That he would somehow be the father she needed? The words felt hollow before he could even form them, promises he wasn't sure he could keep. Instead, he simply said, "Good night, Mercy. If you need anything, my room is just down the hall." She turned her head slightly, acknowledging his words without speaking, then returned her gaze to the window and the vast Montana sky beyond. Silas retreated to his own room, but sleep eluded him as he lay listening to the sounds of the house and wondering what morning would bring to them both. The first week passed in careful observation on both sides. Mercy moved through the house like a ghost, appearing for meals and disappearing just as quietly afterward. She helped Rosa with small tasks when asked, her movements precise and economical, but she never initiated conversation or activity. Silas found himself stealing glances at her during breakfast, searching for some sign of what might reach through the wall of silence she'd built around herself. On the 8th morning, Rosa made a discovery that would change everything. "Senor Silas," she called from the parlor, her voice carrying an unusual note of excitement. "Come see what the little one has done." Silas set down his coffee and followed Rosa's voice to find her standing beside Thomas's old desk, which sat beneath the parlor's east-facing window. The desk had remained largely untouched since his son's death, holding only a few books and the wooden box where Sarah had kept Thomas's childhood treasures. Mercy stood nearby, her face flushed with what might have been embarrassment or fear. On the desk's leather surface lay a piece of paper covered with the most remarkable drawing Silas had ever seen. Created with what appeared to be charcoal from the fireplace, it showed the view from the parlor window, with stunning accuracy the barn, the corrals, Buck leading horses to water, even the old cottonwood tree whose branches framed the scene. But it was more than just accuracy that took Silas's breath away. The drawing captured something ineffable about the ranch, some quality of light and life that made the place feel alive on paper. Every line spoke of careful observation and genuine artistic talent that seemed impossible in someone so young. "Did you draw this, Mercy?" Silas asked softly. Mercy nodded once, her eyes fixed on the floor as if expecting punishment. "It's remarkable," he continued, moving closer to study the details. "I've never seen anything like it. The way you've captured the morning light on the barn roof, the way Buck's posture shows his care for the horses, this is the work of a true artist." For the first time since her arrival, Mercy looked directly at him, surprise flickering across her features. Thomas loved to draw, Silas said, opening the wooden box on the desk. Inside lay his son's childhood artwork crayon sketches of horses and cowboys, watercolor attempts at prairie landscapes, pencil drawings that showed promise, but nothing approaching Mercy's natural skill. He would have been amazed by your talent. Silas pulled out a small wooden box from Thomas's collection, one he'd forgotten existed. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth, lay a set of artist's charcoals that Sarah had bought for Thomas one Christmas. The boy had used them a few times before losing interest in favor of more active pursuits, but they remained in perfect condition. "These belong to Thomas," Silas said, holding out the charcoals. "I think he would want you to have them." Mercy stared at the offered gift, her hands trembling slightly as she reached out to touch the smooth sticks of compressed carbon. When her fingers closed around them, something shifted in her expression, a spark of life that had been buried under layers of trauma and silence. Over the following days, Mercy's artistic output became extraordinary. She drew everything: Rosa kneading bread in the kitchen, Buck shoeing horses in the barn, cattle grazing in the far pastures, the play of shadows across the house's weathered siding. Each drawing revealed new depths of observation and skill, but more importantly, they began to tell stories. The first breakthrough came through a drawing that made Silas's chest tighten with recognition. Mercy had sketched herself sitting at the kitchen table while Rosa ladled soup into her bowl. But in the drawing, Rosa's face glowed with maternal warmth, and tiny lines radiating from the housekeeper's hands suggested the comfort and care she provided. At the bottom of the paper, in careful child's writing, Mercy had written, "Rosa is kind to me." She wrote words, Rosa whispered when she showed Silas the drawing. "The Nina, she is beginning to trust." More drawings followed, each one a window into Mercy's inner world. She drew Buck teaching her to curry a gentle mare, her small hands guided by his weathered ones. She drew the view from her bedroom window at sunset, the sky ablaze with colors that seemed to dance off the paper. She drew the ranch house at night, warm light glowing from its windows like a beacon of safety in the darkness. But it was the drawing she created on her third Sunday at the ranch that truly revealed the depth of her understanding. Dr. Henderson had made his weekly visit to check on her progress, and afterward, as Silas sat on the front porch discussing her condition, Mercy appeared with a piece of paper in her hands. The drawing showed Silas himself, sitting in his chair at the head of the kitchen table. But she'd captured something in his expression that he hadn't realized. He'd been showing a gentleness around the eyes, a softness in the set of his mouth that spoke of carefully contained affection. Around the edges of the drawing, she'd sketched smaller scenes, Silas reading to her in the evenings, Silas teaching her to whistle for the horses, Silas simply watching over her with protective concern. At the bottom, in letters that grew more confident with each word, she had written, "He saved me from the bad man. He gives me a home." Dr. Henderson studied the drawing with professional interest. "This shows remarkable emotional intelligence," he said quietly. "She's processing her experiences, making sense of her new situation through her art. This is precisely the kind of breakthrough we hope to see with trauma victims." "What does it mean for her recovery?" Silas asked. "It means she's beginning to feel safe," the doctor replied. "Safe enough to observe, to interpret, to express. The fact that she's writing words, even simple ones, suggests her selective mutism may be temporary rather than permanent. The art is giving her a voice when spoken words are still too difficult." That evening, as Silas read aloud from one of Thomas's old adventure books, Mercy surprised him by sliding her latest drawing across the table. This one showed the two of them sitting by the fireplace, Silas reading while she sketched. But in the drawing, there was something that hadn't existed in reality. She had drawn herself smiling. "Is this how you'd like things to be?" Silas asked gently. Mercy nodded, then picked up one of her charcoals and carefully wrote beneath the image, "I am happy here." The words were like a key turning in a lock that had been sealed for too long. Silas felt his carefully guarded heart crack open just enough to let hope seep in. This damaged child, who had witnessed horrors he could barely imagine, was beginning to heal. More than that, she was helping him heal as well. But healing, as Silas had learned from his own losses, rarely followed a straight path. 3 days later, a letter arrived that would shatter the fragile peace they had begun to build. Rosa brought it to him with the morning mail, her face troubled by something in the formal script and legal seal. The letter was from a law office in Helena, written on behalf of one Ezra Dalton, who claimed to be Mercy's uncle and only living relative. Mr. Dalton was prepared to assume guardianship of his niece and requested immediate arrangements for her transfer to his custody. The letter went on to question the legality of the auction that had placed Mercy in Silas's care and suggested that proper family placement would be in the child's best interests. Silas read the letter twice, his hands tightening around the paper with each word. When he looked up, he found Mercy watching him from the kitchen doorway, her newly gained confidence already beginning to fade as she sensed the shift in his mood. "What is it, Signor?" Rosa asked, though her expression suggested she already suspected. "Trouble," Silas said quietly, folding the letter and slipping it into his vest pocket. "The kind that threatens everything we've built here." Mercy's eyes were wide with fear, and she clutched her charcoals like talismans against whatever darkness the letter contained. In that moment, Silas realized that somewhere in the past 3 weeks, this silent, wounded child had become more precious to him than his own safety. The thought of losing her, of watching her light be extinguished by whatever plans this unknown uncle harbored, filled him with a protective fury he hadn't felt since Thomas's illness. Whatever came next, he would not let anyone take Mercy away from the home where she was finally beginning to bloom. The war for her future was about to begin, and Silas McCrae intended to win it. Dr. Henderson arrived the next morning in response to Silas's urgent summons, his medical bag accompanied by a leather satchel of legal documents. The physician had served as unofficial mediator in custody disputes before, his reputation for fairness and his understanding of childhood trauma making him invaluable in delicate situations. "The letter troubles me," Silas said, handing over Ezra Dalton's correspondence. "Something about the timing, the formal language, it doesn't feel like a grieving relative seeking family reunion." Dr. Henderson studied the letter carefully, his weathered features growing more concerned with each paragraph. "I share your suspicions. In my experience, legitimate family members don't typically invoke legal threats as their opening gambit. They express concern for the child's welfare, ask about her condition, show some evidence of emotional investment. What do we know about this Ezra Dalton? I've sent inquiries to colleagues in Helena and the surrounding counties. What I've learned isn't encouraging." The doctor pulled out a small notebook. "Ezra Dalton is indeed Mercy's uncle, her father's younger brother. He's married with 5 children of his own, owns a small farm outside Helena that's been struggling for years. His wife died in childbirth 2 years ago, leaving him with children ranging from 3 to 14. Silas felt his stomach tighten. A man with 5 children and a failing farm suddenly develops interest in taking on a 6th child. Precisely my concern. The neighbors I spoke with describe him as a hard man, given to drink when times are difficult. His own children are said to be thin and often dirty, suggesting he's already overwhelmed by his responsibilities. The implications hung heavy between them. A traumatized 11-year-old girl would hardly be seen as additional family to love and protect. She would be viewed as another pair of hands to work, another mouth that could earn her keep through labor. "There's more," Dr. Henderson continued. "I made discreet inquiries about the circumstances of Mercy's parents' deaths. The official cause was listed as a fire that swept through their cabin, but there were whispers of foul play. Apparently, there had been a dispute over land rights between the brothers. Nothing proven, mind you, but enough smoke to suggest fire." Silas stood and walked to the window where Thomas's room lay visible across the hallway. The door remained closed, as it had for 20 years, but now he found himself wondering if it was time to let light and life enter that space again. "She's been drawing," he said quietly. "Remarkable work, but more than that, she's been communicating through her art. Yesterday she wrote that she's happy here. Dr. Henderson, I've watched her begin to heal. I've seen her start to trust again. If this man takes her away, then we must ensure he doesn't." The doctor's voice carried quiet determination. "The question is whether we can prove that removing her from your care would be detrimental to her recovery." They were interrupted by Rosa's gentle knock. "Señores, the little one wishes to show you something." Mercy stood in the doorway, holding a large piece of paper that she'd clearly spent considerable time preparing. When she spread it on the kitchen table, both men drew in sharp breaths. The drawing showed two scenes side by side, like a story told in pictures. On the left, a small figure clearly meant to be Mercy stood on what appeared to be an auction block, surrounded by dark, threatening shapes with reaching hands. The child in the drawing looked terrified, alone, vulnerable to forces beyond her control. On the right side of the paper, the same small figure sat at a kitchen table, surrounded by warm light and gentle faces. Rosa ladled soup, Buck tipped his hat kindly, and Silas read from a book. The child in this scene was smiling, her posture relaxed and safe. Between the two scenes, Mercy had drawn a bridge knot, a physical structure, but a bridge made of charcoal sticks, representing the art supplies that had become her pathway from fear to hope. At the bottom of the page, in her careful handwriting, she had written, "Before and after. I want to stay after." Dr. Henderson removed his spectacles and cleaned them slowly, buying time to compose himself. "This is perhaps the most eloquent testimony I've ever seen regarding a child's welfare. She's not just processing her trauma, she's advocating for her own best interests." "Can we use this legally?" Silas asked. "Potentially, but we need to be careful. The courts generally favor blood relatives unless there's clear evidence of abuse or neglect. We'd need to prove that Mr. Dalton's intentions are suspect and that removing Mercy from your care would cause demonstrable harm." Mercy had been listening to their conversation with the intense focus of someone whose future hung in the balance. Now she moved to the desk and began sketching rapidly, her charcoal flying across the paper with urgent purpose. When she finished, she showed them a drawing of a man they'd never seen tall, thin, with harsh features and hands that seemed to reach greedily toward a small figure cowering in the corner. The resemblance to herself was unmistakable, and the fear in the drawing was palpable. "Is this your uncle?" Dr. Henderson asked gently. Mercy nodded, then picked up her charcoal and wrote, "He scared me before. Mama said stay away from Uncle Ezra." The two men exchanged glances. This was the first indication that Mercy had memories of her uncle, and those memories were clearly negative. "Can you tell us more about your uncle?" Silas asked, settling into a chair beside her. Mercy's hand trembled slightly as she wrote, "He came to our house. Mama hid me in the root cellar. He was angry about something. He and Papa fought." Dr. Henderson leaned forward. "When was this, child?" "Before the fire," Mercy wrote. "He said Papa owed him money, said he would take what was his." The implications of her words settled over them like a cold wind. If Ezra Dalton had been in dispute with his brother before the fire, and if he had threatened to take what was his, then his sudden interest in claiming Mercy took on a more sinister cast. "We need to document everything," Dr. Henderson said. "Her memories, her current state of mind, her progress since arriving here. If this goes to court, we'll need evidence that she's thriving in your care and that returning her to her uncle would be harmful." Over the following days, they worked systematically to build their case. Dr. Henderson conducted formal evaluations of Mercy's mental and physical health, documenting her steady improvement since arriving at the ranch. Rosa testified to the child's gradual emergence from her shell, her growing appetite, her obvious attachment to the ranch routine. Buck, despite his natural reticence, proved to be a valuable witness. "That girl's got ranch sense," he said simply, "knows how to move around horses, how to read the weather, how to make herself useful without getting in the way. She belongs here." But it was Mercy's own drawings that provided the most compelling evidence. Each sketch told a story of healing and growth, of a child finding her place in the world. She drew herself helping Rosa in the kitchen, learning to milk the cow, sitting beside Silas as he read by firelight. In every image, she appeared more confident, more at peace. The room that would prove most significant, however, was the one they hadn't yet discussed. Thomas's bedroom stood at the end of the hall, its door closed but not locked, holding 20 years of memories and the accumulated dreams of a son who would never return home. As the legal battle loomed, Silas found himself standing before that door more often, his hand resting on the cool brass knob. Perhaps it was time to let the past breathe again, to allow new life to inhabit spaces that had been preserved in sorrow for too long. The decision, when it came, would prove to be one of the most important of his life. The decision came on a quiet Thursday evening as Silas stood before Thomas's bedroom door, listening to the sound of Mercy's charcoal scratching against paper in the room down the hall. For 20 years, this door had remained closed. The room beyond, preserved exactly as his son had left it, books on the nightstand, clothes in the wardrobe, even the half-finished model ship still sitting on the desk where Thomas had abandoned it when fever claimed his strength. Sarah's family Bible lay on his own nightstand, its leather binding worn smooth by decades of handling. She had pressed flowers between its pages, wildflowers from their courtship, roses from their wedding, tiny violets that baby Thomas had picked for her on one of his first walks. The Bible represented more than faith. It embodied the continuity of family, the passing of love and wisdom from one generation to the next. Tonight, for the first time since Sarah's death, Silas carried the Bible down the hall to Mercy's room. She looked up from her drawing another ranch scene, this one showing horses running free across the pasture, when he knocked softly on her doorframe. "May I come in?" he asked. Mercy nodded, setting aside her charcoal and watching him with curious eyes. Silas settled into the chair beside her bed, the Bible resting heavily in his hands. "This belonged to my late wife, Sarah. She was Thomas's mother, and before that, it belonged to her mother and grandmother. It's been passed down through generations of women who understood that family isn't just about blood, it's about the love we choose to share." Mercy reached out tentatively to touch the worn leather cover. "Sarah used to read from this every evening," Silas continued. "She'd share stories about faith, about hope, about the belief that even in our darkest moments, we're not alone. I stopped reading it after she died. I suppose I felt too angry, too abandoned to find comfort in those words." He opened the Bible carefully, revealing the pressed flowers scattered throughout its pages, like memories made tangible. Mercy's eyes widened with wonder as she saw the delicate petals still holding traces of their original colors despite the passage of years. "Sarah believed that beautiful things should be preserved," Silas said. "She pressed these flowers because she wanted to remember every season of happiness, every moment of joy. She said that life was like a garden. Some seasons brought storms, but if we tended it carefully, beauty would always return." Mercy picked up her charcoal and wrote, "Can you read to me?" It was the first time she had directly requested anything from him, and the trust implicit in her words nearly overwhelmed him. He opened to the Book of Psalms, Sarah's favorite section, and began to read in the quiet voice he had once used for bedtime stories. As his voice filled the room with ancient words of comfort and hope, Mercy began to sketch. Her drawing took shape gradually, a man and a girl sitting together, a book open between them, pressed flowers scattered around them like blessings. At the bottom of the page she wrote, "This feels like family." The next morning brought their first real test as a family. Sunday services at the Dawson Junction Church had always been more social gathering than spiritual experience, a chance for the scattered ranch families to come together and share news, gossip, and judgment in equal measure. Silas had attended sporadically since Sarah's death, finding more peace in the cathedral of open sky and grassland than in the small wooden church where her funeral had been held. But Mercy needed to be seen, to be accepted by the community that would ultimately influence any legal proceedings. Rosa had spent the morning preparing Mercy for public scrutiny, braiding her hair with ribbons and ensuring her dress was pressed and proper. The child submitted to the fussing with patient resignation, though Silas could see the tension in her shoulders as they prepared for the wagon ride to town. The church buzzed with whispered conversations when they arrived. Silas helped Mercy down from the wagon, noting how she stayed close to his side as they walked toward the building. The congregation's reaction was immediate and divided. Some faces showed genuine warmth and curiosity. Others displayed the suspicious judgment of people who found change threatening. Reverend Morrison, a kind man in his 60s who had officiated at both Sarah's and Thomas's funerals, greeted them at the door with genuine warmth. "Silas McCrae, it's good to see you back with us," he said, then turned to Mercy with gentle attention. "And you must be Miss Mercy. We've heard wonderful things about your artistic talents." Mercy nodded politely but said nothing, her hand finding Silas's sleeve and gripping it tightly. They found seats in the middle of the church, close enough to show respect but far enough from the front to avoid unwanted attention. As Reverend Morrison began his sermon about the parable of the Good Samaritan, Silas felt the weight of watching eyes and whispered comments from the pews around them. "Unusual situation," he caught from Mrs. Pemberton behind them. "That poor child, what she must have endured," came from another voice. "Not natural, a bachelor raising a young girl," whispered someone else. Mercy's grip on his sleeve tightened with each comment, and Silas could see her beginning to withdraw into herself. Then something remarkable happened. She pulled a small piece of paper from her pocket, one of her drawings, folded carefully, and began to sketch on its blank back. When the service ended and the congregation began their usual post-service socializing, Mercy surprised everyone by approaching Mrs. Patterson, the church organist, and offering her the drawing she had created during the sermon. The sketch showed the interior of the church during the service, but it captured something more than physical details. She had drawn the warm light streaming through the windows, the peaceful expressions on the congregants' faces, the sense of community and shared purpose that defined the gathering at its best. At the bottom, in her careful handwriting, she had written, "Thank you for welcoming me." Mrs. Patterson's eyes filled with tears as she studied the drawing. "My dear child," she said, kneeling to Mercy's level, "this is the most beautiful gift I've ever received. You've captured something here that I feel every Sunday, but could never put into words." Word of Mercy's gift spread quickly through the gathering, and soon she was surrounded by gentle faces asking to see more of her work. The initial suspicion and judgment melted away as the congregation recognized the obvious talent and sweet nature of the child in their midst. But it was old Mrs. Henley, the church's unofficial moral authority, who provided the most significant endorsement. "Silas McCrae," she said in her carrying voice, "it's clear to anyone with eyes that this child is thriving in your care. She has the look of a young one who knows she's loved and protected. Anyone who would disturb such obvious contentment would have to answer to me." The drive home passed in comfortable silence, with Mercy sketching the passing landscape and Silas reflecting on the morning's unexpected triumph. They had passed their first public test, but more importantly, Mercy had found her own voice in advocating for their family. That evening, as they sat by the fireplace with Sarah's Bible open between them, Mercy created her most significant drawing yet. She drew the church scene, but in her version, she and Silas sat together in the pew, surrounded by accepting faces and warm light. At the bottom she wrote, "We belong together." As Silas read aloud from the Psalms, he found his own faith beginning to stir again. Perhaps Sarah had been right about seasons of storm and beauty. Perhaps family could bloom in the most unexpected soil, nurtured by patience, protected by love, and blessed by the simple recognition that some bonds transcend blood and circumstance. The legal battle with Ezra Dalton was far from over, but tonight, in the warm circle of lamplight with a child who was becoming his daughter in every way that mattered, Silas felt ready to fight for the family they were creating together. The silver locket had been the first thing Mercy clutched when Rosa helped her from her tattered clothes that first night at the ranch. No bigger than a silver dollar, it hung from a delicate chain that had seen better days, its surface tarnished and dented from years of wear. Mercy never removed it, sleeping with it tucked beneath her nightgown, touching it absently when she felt uncertain or afraid. Neither Silas nor Rosa had pressed her about its contents, respecting the obvious significance it held for the grieving child. It represented her connection to the parents she had lost, perhaps the only tangible link to a life that had ended in fire and tragedy. 3 weeks into October, that locket would prove to hold secrets that would reshape everything they thought they knew about Mercy's past. The trouble began with a second letter from Ezra Dalton's attorney, this one more aggressive in tone and specific in its threats. Legal action would commence within 30 days unless Mercy was surrendered to her rightful family. The letter questioned Silas's moral fitness as a guardian, suggested impropriety in a bachelor raising a young girl, and hinted at political connections that could expedite the case through territorial courts. He's escalating because he knows time isn't on his side, Dr. Henderson observed as they reviewed the correspondence in Silas's study. The longer Mercy remains in your care, the stronger our argument becomes about her best interests. But can we win? Silas asked bluntly. Against blood relatives and whatever political influence he claims to have? Honestly, it will be difficult. Territorial law strongly favors family claims, and judges are reluctant to override parental or familial rights without compelling evidence of abuse or neglect. That evening, as storm clouds gathered over the ranch and wind rattled the windows, Silas found Mercy sitting at Thomas's old desk, working on a drawing by lamplight. She had been quieter since the second letter arrived, as if she sensed the growing threat to her security even without understanding its specifics. "May I see what you're working on?" he asked gently. Mercy slid the paper toward him, revealing a drawing that made his chest tighten with emotion. She had sketched the ranch house at night, warm light glowing from every window, smoke rising peacefully from the chimney. But it was the details that moved him most. The figures visible through the windows showed a complete family. Rosa in the kitchen, Buck reading in the parlor, and in the largest window, Silas and Mercy sitting together, a book open between them. At the bottom, she had written, "Home is where people love you." "Mercy," Silas said carefully, "I need you to know that there are people who want to take you away from here. Your uncle, your father's brother, believes you should live with his family instead." Mercy's hand went immediately to her locket, gripping it tightly. Her eyes filled with fear, and she shook her head vigorously. "I don't want to lose you either," Silas continued. "But I need you to help me understand everything about your family, about what happened before you came here. Sometimes the truth is the only thing that can protect us." Mercy stared at him for a long moment, then picked up her charcoal and wrote, "Uncle Ezra is a bad man. Can you tell me why you think that?" Her hand trembled as she wrote, "He hurt Mama, made her cry. Papa said he was dangerous." "When did this happen?" "Many times. He came to our house when Papa was away. Mama would hide me and tell me to be very quiet." Each revelation felt like a piece of a puzzle clicking into place, forming a picture that grew more disturbing with every detail. Silas encouraged Mercy to continue, and slowly, through written words and simple drawings, she began to reveal the truth about her family's final months. Ezra Dalton had been pressuring his brother for money, claiming debts and demanding his share of their father's inheritance. When Mercy's father refused, Ezra had grown increasingly threatening. He had visited their small homestead repeatedly, sometimes drunk, always angry. Mercy's mother had lived in constant fear, sending letters to relatives begging for help that never came. "The night of the fire," Mercy wrote, her letters growing less steady with each word. "Uncle Ezra came very angry. He fought with Papa outside. Mama put me in the root cellar and told me to stay hidden, no matter what I heard." "What did you hear?" Silas asked gently. Mercy's answer came in pictures rather than words. She drew her uncle's face, twisted with rage. She drew flames. She drew her parents' cabin burning, while a figure on horseback rode away. At the bottom, in letters that grew increasingly shaky, she wrote, "He killed them." The silence that followed was filled with the sound of wind and rain against the windows, nature's fury providing a backdrop for the revelation of human evil. Silas felt a cold anger settling in his chest, the protective rage of a father whose child had been threatened. "Did anyone else know about your uncle's visits?" he asked. "Mrs. Garrett next farm over. She saw him come sometimes. She told Mama to go to the sheriff, but Mama was too scared." "And after the fire?" "Mrs. Garrett took me to town. Said Uncle Ezra was family, he would come for me. But I ran away and hid until the widow lady found me." The pieces of Mercy's story painted a picture of systematic intimidation followed by murder, with a traumatized child as the only witness. It also explained Ezra's sudden urgency to claim custody. Mercy represented not just free labor, but a potential threat to his freedom if she ever found her voice to accuse him. "Mercy," Silas said carefully, "what you've told me is very important. Your uncle hurt your parents, and now he wants to make sure you can never tell anyone about it. That's why he wants to take you away from here." Mercy nodded, tears flowing freely now, as the truth she had carried alone for months finally found expression. "I won't let him take you," Silas promised, "but we need to be very careful about how we handle this information. Dr. Henderson needs to hear your story, and eventually the sheriff will need to know what really happened to your parents." "Will they believe me?" Mercy wrote. "They'll believe the truth," Silas said, though privately he worried about the challenge of convincing authorities based on the testimony of a traumatized child who had been mute for months. That night, Mercy slept fitfully, waking twice from nightmares that sent her running to Silas's room for comfort. Each time, she clutched her locket as if it were a talisman against the darkness of her memories. The second time she appeared in his doorway, shaking and tears-streaked, Silas made a decision that felt both natural and terrifying. "Would you like to sleep in Thomas's room tonight?" he asked. "Sometimes when we're scared, it helps to be in a place where we know we're safe." Mercy nodded eagerly, and together they walked down the hall to the room that had been closed for 20 years. Silas opened the door, lit a lamp, and for the first time since his son's death, allowed life to enter the space that had been preserved in sorrow. The room welcomed them like an old friend, and as Mercy settled into Thomas's bed, surrounded by his books and treasures, Silas realized that some gifts are meant to be shared across time. His son would have wanted this room to shelter another child, to provide comfort to someone who needed the safety it represented. "Thank you," Mercy whispered the first words she had spoken aloud since arriving at the ranch. Silas felt his eyes fill with tears as the sound of her voice, small but clear, filled the space where his son had once slept. The healing they both needed was happening, one quiet revelation at a time. The hand-carved wooden horse took shape slowly over the course of November evenings, emerging from a piece of cottonwood under Silas's patient knife. Working by lamplight after the day's chores were finished, he found himself returning to a skill he hadn't practiced since Thomas was small. When bedtime required stories and toys crafted from whatever materials the ranch provided. Mercy had moved into Thomas's room permanently now, and with that transition came a gradual flowering of her personality that amazed everyone who witnessed it. She spoke more frequently, though still in whispers, and her laughter, when it came, sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, delicate but pure. The wooden horse represented more than just a toy. As Silas carved its flowing mane and graceful legs, he found himself thinking about the childhood Mercy should have had, the innocent pleasures that had been stolen from her by trauma and loss. Each careful cut of his knife was an act of faith, a belief that she could still experience joy, despite everything she had endured. "What are you making, Papa Silas?" Mercy asked one evening, settling beside his chair with her sketchbook. The title had emerged naturally over the past weeks, neither forced nor formal, simply the word that felt right to both of them. "A horse," he said, holding up the partially carved figure. "I thought you might like to have one of your own, since you spend so much time drawing the real ones." Mercy's eyes lit up with delight as she examined his work. "It looks like Starlight," she whispered, referring to the gentle mare that Buck had been teaching her to ride. "That was my intention," Silas smiled. Starlight seems to have claimed you as her own. Rosa says she wickers every time you walk past her stall. It was true. The bond between Mercy and the white-blazed mare had developed quickly, based on mutual gentleness and an intuitive understanding that seemed to transcend the usual rider-horse relationship. Starlight had been Thomas's favorite mount, a fact that Silas hadn't mentioned, but somehow suspected Mercy understood. "Buck says I have good hands," Mercy said proudly. "He says Starlight trusts me because I'm patient with her." "Buck's right. You have the gift of gentleness, Mercy. It's a rare thing, and more valuable than you might realize." Over the following days, Mercy's world continued to expand beyond the confines of her earlier fear. She helped Rosa with the cooking, her small hands learning to knead bread and stir soup with the same careful attention she brought to her artwork. She assisted Buck with the gentler aspects of ranch work, feeding chickens and collecting eggs, brushing horses and cleaning tack. But it was the evenings that held the most magic. After supper, when the dishes were cleared and the day's work finished, they would gather in the parlor. Rosa would bring her mending, Buck would read from his collection of dime novels, and Silas would work on his carving, while Mercy sketched by lamplight. These quiet, domestic scenes represented everything Ezra Dalton threatened to destroy. The legal pressure had intensified throughout November, with increasingly urgent letters from his attorney and rumors that he planned to arrive in person to press his claim. Dr. Henderson had documented Mercy's progress extensively, but they all knew that family law favored blood relations regardless of a child's obvious well-being. "I've been thinking about your uncle's claim," Silas said one evening as he put the finishing touches on the wooden horse's bridle. "There may be ways to challenge his fitness as a guardian, especially if we can prove his involvement in your parents' deaths." Mercy looked up from her drawing, anxiety flickering across her features. "What if no one believes me? What if they say I'm just a scared little girl making up stories?" "Then we'll have to make sure your story is heard by the right people," Silas replied. "Dr. Henderson has been in contact with a territorial marshal who specializes in difficult cases. Marshal Clayton has experience with family disputes and crimes that local sheriffs might not be equipped to handle. Will I have to tell him everything?" "Only when you're ready. But Mercy, sometimes the truth is the only weapon we have against people who use fear and intimidation to get what they want." The wooden horse was nearly complete now, its carved features capturing the spirit of the living animal it represented. As Silas worked on the final details, he found himself thinking about legacy, not just the material things we leave behind, but the love we invest in the people who matter to us. Thomas would never carry on the McRae name or inherit the ranch, but perhaps that wasn't the only way to ensure continuity. Mercy was becoming his daughter in every way that mattered, and through her, the ranch would have new life and purpose. "It's finished," he announced, holding up the completed carving. Mercy gasped with delight as she examined the wooden horse. Every detail was perfect, from the flowing tail to the alert ears to the gentle expression that perfectly captured Starlight's patient nature. "She's beautiful," Mercy whispered, cradling the carving against her chest. "Thank you, Papa Silas. I'll treasure her always." "There's something else," Silas said, reaching into his vest pocket. "I carved this too." He pulled out a second, smaller figura rider that perfectly fit the horse's back. The tiny person wore a dress and had long hair, clearly meant to represent Mercy herself. "Now you can ride Starlight anytime you want," he said, fitting the figures together. Mercy's eyes filled with tears as she held the complete set. In her mind, this wasn't just a toy, it was a promise. A promise that she belonged here, that she would always have a place at Cottonwood Range, that the bond between them was strong enough to weather whatever storms might come. That night, as Mercy settled into Thomas's bed with the wooden horse on her nightstand, she created one final drawing for the day. It showed herself and Silas in the parlor, he carving while she sketched, Rosa mending in her chair, Buck reading by the fire. At the bottom, in letters that grew more confident with each word, she wrote, "This is my real family. Please don't let anyone take me away." Silas found the drawing on his breakfast plate the next morning, and as he read her plea, he felt his resolve crystallize into something unbreakable. Legal challenges and family claims aside, he would not allow anyone to destroy the healing that had taken place within these walls. The wooden horse sat on Mercy's nightstand like a guardian, watching over her dreams and representing all the childhood joys she was finally free to experience. Whatever came next, they would face it together, not as guardian and ward, but as father and daughter, bound by choice rather than blood, strengthened by love rather than obligation. The battle for Mercy's future was approaching its climax, but in the warm sanctuary of Cottonwood Range, they had built something worth fighting for. December brought the first heavy snow to Cottonwood Range, transforming the familiar landscape into something magical and pristine. Mercy pressed her face to the frosted window of Thomas's room, watching the flakes dance in the lamplight like tiny spirits, celebrating the approaching holiday season. It was during one of these quiet morning observations that she made the discovery that would change everything. She had been examining her silver locket more closely, running her fingers over its tarnished surface, as she often did when feeling contemplative. The piece had seemed solid, unchangeable, a simple keepsake from her lost parents. But as she traced the decorative border that morning, her fingernail caught on what felt like a tiny imperfection in the metal. "Papa, Silas," she called softly, her voice carrying a note of excitement that brought him quickly to her side. "What is it, sweetheart?" "I think there's something wrong with my locket. It feels like it's cracked, but not broken." Silas examined the piece carefully, his weathered fingers finding the same irregularity that had caught Mercy's attention. What appeared to be decorative etching around the locket's edge was actually a hairline seam, so precisely crafted that it was nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it. "It's not cracked," he said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice. "I think it opens differently than we thought." With careful pressure applied to specific points around the border, the locket revealed its true nature. The back panel slid away, revealing a hidden compartment that neither of them had suspected existed. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oiled silk, lay a tiny leather-bound book no bigger than Mercy's palm. Mercy's hands trembled as she lifted out the hidden treasure. The book's cover was embossed with her mother's initials, M.L.D., Martha Louise Dalton. "It's Mama's diary," Mercy whispered, her voice filled with awe and longing. The diary's pages were filled with her mother's careful handwriting, documenting the final months of her life in entries that grew increasingly desperate and fearful. As Silas read aloud from the tiny pages, a story emerged that was far more horrifying than even Mercy's traumatic memories had suggested. The first entries spoke of Ezra's escalating demands for money, his claims that their father had promised him half of everything when he died. Martha Dalton had documented each threatening visit, each incident of intimidation, creating a careful record, as if she somehow knew it might one day be needed as evidence. "October 15th, 1891, Silas read. "Ezra came again today while William was in town. He grows bolder in his threats, saying that one way or another, he'll have what's rightfully his. When I reminded him that father left everything to William as the elder son, he laughed in a way that chilled my blood. He said there were ways to change inheritance, and that accidents happened to people who weren't careful." The entries continued, each one more disturbing than the last. Ezra had been systematically planning something terrible, using his brother's absence to terrorize Martha and gather information about their routines, their neighbors, their vulnerabilities. November 3rd, 1891, another entry read, "Found evidence that someone has been watching our house. Footprints near the windows, signs that someone has been testing the doors and shutters. I'm frightened for Mercy. If something happens to William and me, what will become of her? Ezra has made it clear he sees her as nothing more than an extra pair of hands for his household. I've sewn this diary into my locket's secret compartment. If the worst happens, perhaps someday it will serve as proof of his intentions." The most damning entry came near the end of the diary, dated just 3 days before the fire that claimed Mercy's parents. November 18th, 1891, Silas read, his voice growing hard with anger. Ezra visited again today, drunk and more threatening than ever. He told me plainly that William would either sign over half the property or face the consequences. When I asked what he meant, he said that sometimes buildings catch fire, and sometimes people get trapped inside them. He looked directly at Mercy when he said this. I know now that we're all in mortal danger. I've written to my sister in Colorado, begging her to take Mercy if anything happens to us, but I fear the letter won't reach her in time. God help us, I believe Ezra means to kill us all. The final entry was written in shaking handwriting, clearly composed in haste and terror. November 20, honest 1891. William has gone to town for supplies. Ezra arrived an hour ago with 2 men I don't recognize. I can hear them outside, arguing about something. I've hidden Mercy in the root cellar and told her not to come out no matter what she hears. If anyone ever finds this diary, know that Ezra Dalton murdered his own brother and sister-in-law for 30 acres of farmland and a few head of cattle. He is a monster who must not be allowed to harm Mercy. She is the light of our lives, innocent and pure. Please, if God is merciful, let someone protect her from the evil that destroyed her family. The room fell silent, except for the sound of snow against the window and Mercy's quiet sobbing. The diary had confirmed their worst suspicions and provided evidence that went far beyond a child's traumatic memories. Martha Dalton had documented a clear pattern of threats, intimidation, and ultimately a confession of murderous intent. This changes everything, Silas said quietly, closing the tiny book with reverent care. Your mother was incredibly brave to create this record. She knew the danger she and your father faced, but she also knew that the truth needed to survive, even if she didn't. Will this be enough to stop Uncle Ezra? Mercy asked through her tears. More than enough. This diary provides evidence of premeditated murder. Marshal Clayton will be very interested in reading these entries. But even as Silas spoke with confidence, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather outside. If Ezra Dalton was desperate enough to murder his own brother, he wouldn't hesitate to eliminate any threat to his freedom. The diary that could save Mercy might also make her an even greater target. We need to be very careful about how we handle this information, Silas continued. Your uncle doesn't know about the diary's existence, but if he suspects you have evidence against him, he might try something desperate. I'm scared, Mercy whispered, clutching the locket to her chest. That's natural, sweetheart, but remember that you're not alone anymore. You have people who love you and will protect you. Your uncle made a terrible mistake when he chose greed over family. Now he'll face the consequences of that choice. As if summoned by their discussion, Buck appeared in the doorway with an expression that sent alarm through Silas's chest. Boss, we've got company coming up the road. 3 riders, moving fast despite the snow. One of them matches the description Dr. Henderson gave us of Ezra Dalton. Silas felt his blood turn to ice. The man who had murdered Mercy's parents was approaching their home, probably with the intention of taking her by force before any legal challenges could be mounted. How much time do we have? Silas asked. 10 minutes, maybe 15, if the snow slows them down. Silas's mind raced through their options. They could try to hide Mercy, but Ezra would simply tear the house apart looking for her. They could attempt to flee, but the storm would make travel dangerous and probably impossible. Their best option was to face the threat directly, but with the diary as evidence and the certainty that Ezra wouldn't hesitate to use violence. Mercy, Silas said, his voice calm despite the urgency of their situation. I need you to take your mother's diary and hide it somewhere very safe, somewhere no one would think to look. Where? Thomas's old school books are in the bottom drawer of his desk. Slip the diary inside one of them, toward the back where the pages aren't worn. If something happens to me, make sure Marshal Clayton gets that diary. Nothing's going to happen to you, Mercy said fiercely. I won't let him hurt my family again. The transformation in her voice was remarkable. The frightened, traumatized child had been replaced by someone stronger, someone who had found her courage in the love and security of her new home. The diary had given her more than evidence, it had given her the truth, and with truth came power. As the sound of approaching horses grew louder through the snow, Silas realized that the real battle for Mercy's future was about to begin. But this time, they had weapons that Ezra Dalton didn't know existed. The truth, the law, and the unbreakable bond of a family that chose to stand together against the darkness. The sheriff's badge caught the lamplight as Marshal Clayton pinned it to his vest, the silver star representing federal authority that superseded local jurisdiction. He had arrived at Cottonwood Range just 2 hours after Buck's urgent ride to town, bringing with him the legal power to arrest suspected murderers and the experience to handle dangerous confrontations. "I've read the diary," Clayton said, his weathered face grim with determination. "Mrs. Dalton documented enough evidence to hang her brother-in-law twice over. But we need to be careful about how we proceed. Cornered killers are unpredictable, and he's brought armed men with him." Through the parlor window, they could see Ezra Dalton and his companions setting up what appeared to be a siege camp near the ranch gates. 3 men, well armed and clearly prepared for trouble, had positioned themselves to control the main road while maintaining a clear view of the house. "He's not trying to hide his intentions," Buck observed, studying the riders through field glasses. "That's either arrogance or desperation." "Both, I'd guess," Marshal Clayton replied. "He knows the legal challenges are mounting, so he's decided to take what he wants by force. Classic behavior for someone who's gotten away with violence before." Silas checked the loads in his shotgun, the same weapon that had seen him through the Civil War and countless dangerous situations since. The familiar weight of it in his hands brought back memories of other battles, other times when violence had been the only language that evil men understood. "I want Mercy somewhere safe before this starts," he said. "Rosa's prepared the storm cellar with food and blankets. If shooting starts, that's where she needs to be." "I don't want to hide," Mercy said from the doorway, her voice carrying a strength that surprised all of them. "Uncle Ezra has made me run and hide my whole life. I'm not going to let him do it anymore." Marshal Clayton studied the young girl with professional assessment. At 11 years old, she had already shown remarkable courage in providing testimony that could convict a murderer. But this was different. This was the moment when legal justice would meet frontier violence, and the outcome was far from certain. "Mercy," the marshal said gently, "your bravery has already given us the evidence we need to put your uncle away forever, but courage doesn't mean putting yourself in unnecessary danger. The best thing you can do now is stay safe, so that justice can be served." "He killed my parents," Mercy replied, her young voice carrying depths of pain and determination that spoke to experiences no child should have endured. "He tried to make everyone think it was an accident, but I know the truth. I saw him riding away while our house burned." "And that testimony will help convict him," Clayton assured her. "But first, we need to make sure he can't hurt anyone else." The strategic planning that followed drew on every man's experience with conflict and violence. Buck knew the ranch's terrain better than anyone, able to predict approach routes and defensive positions. Marshal Clayton brought professional law enforcement tactics and an understanding of how desperate criminals behaved when trapped. Silas contributed the steady leadership that had made him a successful rancher and a respected member of the community. "He'll try to get close to the house," Clayton predicted. "Probably send 1 man around back while he and the 3rd one approach from the front. Classic pincer movement, designed to divide our attention and create confusion." "The root cellar where Mercy hid during the fire," Buck suggested. "It's accessible from outside the house, hidden by the woodshed. If things go bad, we could get her out that way." "No," Silas said firmly. "We're not running from this. Ezra Dalton has terrorized this family long enough. It ends here tonight." As darkness settled over the snow-covered ranch, the men made their final preparations. Extra ammunition was distributed, defensive positions were chosen, and escape routes were identified in case retreat became necessary. But underneath the tactical planning, a deeper transformation was taking place. Silas McCrae, who had spent 20 years avoiding emotional entanglements, found himself preparing to risk everything for the child who had become his daughter. The protective instincts that had been dormant since Thomas's death had awakened with a fierce intensity that surprised him with its power. "You know," he said to Marshal Clayton as they checked the loads in their weapons, "6 months ago I was content to live alone, to avoid the pain that comes with caring about people. Mercy changed all of that. She gave me a reason to feel alive again." "Good families are worth fighting for," the Marshal replied. "I've seen too many cases where children get lost in legal systems that care more about blood relations than actual welfare. What you've built here, this, is what family is supposed to look like." Rosa appeared with a tray of coffee and sandwiches, her usually cheerful demeanor replaced by the grim determination of someone who had also claimed Mercy as family worth protecting. "The Nina is in Thomas's room," she reported. "I told her to stay away from the windows, but she insists on keeping watch. She says she wants to see when her uncle gets what he deserves. She's been through more trauma than most adults could handle," Dr. Henderson observed. He had arrived an hour earlier, officially to provide medical support if needed, but really because he couldn't bear to stay away during the confrontation that would determine Mercy's future. The fact that she's standing strong instead of cowering shows incredible resilience. "It shows she knows she's loved," Silas corrected. "Children can endure almost anything if they know someone cares enough to protect them." The waiting stretched through the evening as snow continued to fall, creating an eerily peaceful backdrop for the violence that everyone knew was coming. Ezra Dalton seemed content to maintain his position near the gates, perhaps hoping that the psychological pressure would force a surrender. But as midnight approached, the situation began to escalate. One of Dalton's companions rode closer to the house, shouting demands that echoed across the snow-muffled landscape. "McCrae, send out the girl and there won't be any trouble. She belongs with family, not with some old bachelor who don't know the first thing about raising children." Silas stepped onto the front porch, his shotgun cradled in his arms, but not yet raised in an overtly threatening manner. "The only family that girl has is right here," he called back. "If you want to discuss custody, you can do it through the courts like civilized people." "Courts take too long," the rider shouted. "The girl's coming with us tonight, one way or another." "Over my dead body," Silas replied, his voice carrying across the snow with absolute finality. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, and everyone present understood that negotiations had just ended. Whatever happened next would be settled through violence, with Mercy's future hanging in the balance. Marshal Clayton moved to the window that offered the best view of the approaching riders. "They're making their move," he reported quietly. "Two coming toward the front, one circling around toward the barn, just like we expected." Silas felt the familiar calm that had always come over him in moments of extreme danger. The uncertainty was over, the waiting was done. Everything he cared about in the world was inside this house, and he would defend it with every ounce of strength and skill he possessed. "Mercy," he called softly toward the stairs. "It's time, sweetheart. I need you to go to the storm cellar now." "I love you, Papa Silas," came her voice from the darkness above. "Please be careful." "I love you too, daughter. This will all be over soon, and then we can get back to being a family." The wooden horse he had carved for her sat on the kitchen table, a silent reminder of all the innocent pleasures that childhood should contain. When this night was over, he intended to make sure Mercy could enjoy every one of them, free from the shadow of fear that had haunted her young life. Outside, the sound of horses moving through snow grew closer, and Marshal Clayton's hand moved to his service revolver. The moment of truth was approaching, and with it, the final confrontation between a murderer's greed and a father's love. The badge on Clayton's chest caught the lamplight one more time as he took his position by the front door. Justice was coming to Cottonwood Range, and Ezra Dalton was about to learn that some crimes carry consequences that can't be escaped through intimidation or violence. The battle for Mercy's soul was about to begin. The shotgun above the mantel had waited 27 years for this moment. Silas lifted the weapon with hands that remembered its weight and balance from countless battles during the war between the states, when he had carried it through Georgia mud and Pennsylvania rain. The weapon had saved his life more times than he could count, and tonight it would defend the most precious thing in his world. "That's far enough," Silas called out, as the three riders approached the house, their forms dark silhouettes against the snow-covered landscape. Ezra Dalton spurred his horse forward, close enough now that Silas could see the cruel twist of his mouth and the calculating coldness in his eyes. This was a man who had murdered his own brother without remorse, who saw his traumatized niece as nothing more than property to be claimed. "I've come for what's mine, McCrae," Ezra shouted, his voice carrying the arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "The girl belongs with blood family, not with some lonely old fool playing house." "She's not property to be claimed," Silas replied, his finger resting on the shotgun's trigger. "She's a child who deserves safety and love, neither of which she'll find with you." "Love don't put food on the table or clothes on backs," Ezra sneered. "The girl's old enough to work for her keep, and I've got need of another pair of hands. Now send her out before things get unpleasant." Marshal Clayton stepped into view from the shadow of the porch, his badge gleaming in the moonlight and his service revolver drawn but held low. "Ezra Dalton," he called out with official authority, "you're under arrest for the murders of William and Martha Dalton. Drop your weapons and surrender peacefully." For a moment, shocked silence fell over the scene. Then Ezra's face twisted with rage as he realized his carefully constructed facade was crumbling. "You've got no proof of anything," he snarled. "Those deaths were ruled accidental. House fire happens all the time to careless folks." "We have proof," Marshal Clayton replied calmly. "Your sister-in-law documented your threats, your visits, your own confession of intent to kill. She was a very thorough woman, Mr. Dalton." The color drained from Ezra's face as the implications hit him. If Martha had somehow left evidence behind, if Mercy had access to testimony that could convict him, then his freedom, perhaps his life, hung in the balance. "Impossible," he whispered, but his voice carried the hollow sound of a man who knew he was caught. "Martha Dalton kept a diary," Clayton continued, his words carrying across the snow like a death sentence. "She documented every threat you made, every intimidation, every plan you shared with her before you murdered her and her husband for 30 acres of farmland." "That little bitch," Ezra snarled, his mask of righteousness finally slipping away to reveal the monster beneath. "I should have killed her too when I had the chance." The confession hung in the air like gunpowder smoke, witnessed by multiple men and carrying the weight of legal conviction. But rather than accepting defeat, Ezra's desperation transformed into the dangerous fury of a cornered animal. "If I'm going down," he screamed, drawing his pistol with desperate speed, "I'm taking that meddling girl with me." The first shot shattered the winter silence like breaking glass. Ezra's bullet splintered the porch rail inches from Silas's head, sending wooden fragments flying through the cold air. The two men with him opened fire simultaneously, their muzzle flashes lighting up the snow-covered yard like deadly fireworks. Silas's shotgun roared in response, the familiar kick against his shoulder, bringing back muscle memory from 100 battles. His shot took down Ezra's horse, sending the murderer tumbling into the snow, but leaving him very much alive and still armed. Marshal Clayton's revolver barked twice in rapid succession, driving one of the hired guns back toward the barn, while Buck's rifle cracked from the kitchen window, keeping the third man pinned behind the water trough. "He's moving toward the house," Buck shouted over the gunfire, "trying to get to the girl." Silas saw Ezra crawling through the snow, using his dead horse as cover while he worked his way closer to the front porch. The man's desperation had transformed him into something more dangerous than a simple killer. He had become a predator with nothing left to lose. "Not in my house," Silas growled, breaking the shotgun open and feeding in fresh shells with practiced efficiency. "Not to my daughter." The Civil War had taught him that some battles were fought not for territory or politics, but for the people you couldn't bear to lose. Tonight, as snow swirled around the ranch house and gunfire echoed across the Montana landscape, Silas McCrae was fighting for the future of the child who had given his life meaning again. Ezra Dalton had made the fatal mistake of threatening the wrong family. Now he would learn that some fathers would go to any lengths, including killing, to protect their children from evil. Mercy's drawing of justice would be created hours after the gunfire ended, but its image was already forming in her mind as she crept from Thomas's room to the top of the stairs. Against all instructions to stay hidden, she needed to witness the moment when her uncle finally faced consequences for his crimes. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the house as Ezra kicked in the kitchen door, his face twisted with murderous rage and desperate fury. Snow clung to his coat and hat, and blood seeped from a bullet graze on his left arm, but his gun hand remained steady as he searched the shadows for his target. "Mercy!" he bellowed, his voice echoing through the rooms like a curse. "Come out now, girl. You've caused enough trouble with your lies and fantasies." From her position on the stairs, Mercy could see Marshal Clayton moving silently through the parlor, positioning himself to cut off Ezra's escape route. Buck had circled around from the kitchen, while Silas approached from the front hall, their coordinated movement speaking to years of shared experience in dangerous situations. But it was Mercy herself who would determine the outcome of this confrontation. "I'm here, Uncle Ezra," she said, stepping into view at the top of the stairs. Her voice rang clear and strong through the house, no longer the whisper of a traumatized child, but the firm declaration of someone who had found her courage. In her hands, she held her mother's diary, the small leather book that contained the evidence to convict her parents' killer. Ezra's eyes fixed on the diary with the fascination of a snake watching its prey. "Give me that book, girl. Whatever lies your mother wrote, they died with her in that fire." "They're not lies," Mercy replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Mama wrote the truth about what you did, about how you threatened us, about how you planned to kill them for money. She knew you were evil, and she made sure someone would know the truth someday." "Truth?" Ezra laughed bitterly, raising his pistol toward the stairs. "The truth is that your parents were weak fools who didn't deserve what they had. The truth is that you're nothing but a burden that needs to learn her place. The truth," came Marshal Clayton's voice from behind him, "is that you're under arrest for murder." Ezra spun around, his gun swinging toward the lawman, but his movement brought him directly into Silas's line of fire. The shotgun boomed once more, and Ezra Dalton's reign of terror ended in the same house where he had planned to claim his final victim. In the sudden silence that followed, Mercy descended the stairs with careful dignity, still clutching her mother's diary. She walked past her uncle's motionless form without a glance, her attention focused entirely on the man who had become her father in every way that mattered. "Papa Silas," she said, her voice carrying the relief of someone who had finally escaped a nightmare that had lasted far too long. "Is it over?" "It's over, sweetheart," Silas replied, setting down his shotgun and opening his arms to receive her. "You're safe now. You'll always be safe." Mercy ran to him then, the diary still clutched in one hand while she threw her other arm around his waist. The embrace was fierce and desperate, a father and daughter clinging to each other in the aftermath of violence that had threatened to tear their family apart. "I wasn't scared," Mercy said against his chest, though her trembling belied her words. "I knew you would protect me. I knew you wouldn't let him take me away." "Never," Silas murmured into her hair. "No one will ever take you away from this family again." Marshal Clayton holstered his weapon and knelt beside Ezra's body, checking for signs of life that weren't there. "It's finished," he announced quietly. "Ezra Dalton will never hurt anyone again." The two hired gunmen had surrendered once their employer fell, their mercenary loyalty evaporating the moment the shooting stopped. Buck had them secured with rope from the barn, their weapons confiscated and their futures uncertain pending investigation into their role in the night's events. "What happens now?" Mercy asked, looking up at Silas with eyes that held wisdom far beyond her years. "Now we make sure everyone knows the truth," Marshal Clayton said, accepting the diary that Mercy offered him. "This evidence will clear up any questions about what really happened to your parents, and it will ensure that no one else tries to question your place in this family." Dr. Henderson appeared from the storm cellar where he had waited out the gunfight, his medical bag ready but thankfully unnecessary. His face showed the strain of the evening's events, but also profound relief that justice had finally been served. "How do you feel, Mercy?" he asked gently, settling into professional mode to assess her psychological state after witnessing such violence. "I feel free," she answered without hesitation. "For the first time since the fire, I feel like I can breathe properly. Uncle Ezra can't hurt anyone anymore, and I don't have to be afraid of him coming to take me away." It was then that she pulled out the piece of paper she had been working on during the confrontation. The drawing that would become her testament to justice served. The sketch showed her uncle facing Marshal Clayton, his face filled with the rage and desperation of a cornered killer. But in the drawing, justice stood tall and unafraid, represented by the badge on the marshal's chest and the protective stance of the men who had risked their lives to keep her safe. At the bottom of the page, in letters that grew stronger and more confident with each word, she had written, "Evil loses when good people stand together." "This is remarkable," Dr. Henderson observed, studying the drawing with professional admiration. "She's processed the entire traumatic experience and emerged with a clear understanding of justice and protection. This shows remarkable psychological resilience." "She's a McCrae," Silas said simply, pride evident in his voice. "McCraes don't back down from what's right, and they don't let evil win if they can help it." As dawn broke over Cottonwood Range, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, the cleanup began. Ezra's body was removed by the territorial marshal's men, and statements were taken from everyone who had witnessed the night's events. But for Mercy and Silas, the most important work was already done. They sat together at the kitchen table as Rosa prepared breakfast, the events of the night already taking on the quality of a nightmare that had finally ended. Mercy worked on a new drawing, this one showing the ranch house in morning sunlight, smoke rising peacefully from the chimney, and two figures visible through the window, father and daughter reading together by lamplight. "No more hiding," Mercy said as she added final details to her sketch. "No more being afraid. No more wondering when someone might try to take me away." "No more," Silas agreed. "From now on, we can focus on the important things being a family, learning and growing together, making this ranch a place where love lives and flourishes." The wooden horse still sat on the kitchen table where Silas had left it the night before, a symbol of all the childhood joys that Mercy could now experience freely. As she reached for it with one hand while continuing to draw with the other, Silas realized that the healing was complete for both of them. Evil had tested their family and found it stronger than fear, more enduring than violence, and more powerful than the greed that had destroyed so many lives. In the end, love had proven to be the strongest force of all. 6 months later, the adoption papers lay spread across Judge Morrison's mahogany desk like promises made manifest. The legal documents that would make Mercy officially a McCrae bore the territorial seal and the signatures of everyone who had witnessed her transformation from traumatized orphan to beloved daughter. "In all my years on the bench," Judge Morrison said, removing his spectacles to clean them carefully, "I've rarely seen a case where the best interests of a child were so clearly served. Miss Mercy, do you understand what these papers mean?" Mercy nodded solemnly, her hand resting in Silas's as they sat before the judge's desk. She wore her finest dress on that Rosa had sewn, especially for this occasion, and her hair was braided with blue ribbons that matched her eyes. The silver locket still hung around her neck, but now it represented triumph over tragedy rather than grief over loss. "It means Papa Silas will be my real father forever," she said clearly, her voice carrying none of the hesitation that had marked her early days at the ranch. "It means I'm home for good, and no one can ever take me away again." "That's exactly what it means," the judge confirmed with a warm smile. "Silas McCrae, you understand the responsibilities you're accepting? This child will be your daughter in every legal sense, with all the rights and protections that status provides." "Your Honor," Silas replied, his voice thick with emotion, "she's been my daughter in every way that matters since the day I brought her home. These papers just make it official." The judge's pen scratched across the documents with ceremonial finality, each signature bringing them closer to the moment they had all been working toward. When the last form was completed, he stood and extended his hand in congratulation. "Congratulations, Mr. McCrae, and congratulations to you, Miss Mercy McCrae. May your family know many years of happiness together." Outside the courthouse, the spring afternoon was warm and bright, with cottonwood trees beginning to show their first green leaves. Dr. Henderson waited on the steps with Buck and Rosa, all of them beaming with the satisfaction of witnessing justice properly served. "How does it feel to be officially a McCrae?" Dr. Henderson asked, kneeling to Mercy's level with the gentle attention that had helped her through so many difficult months. "It feels like coming home," Mercy replied, then surprised everyone by throwing her arms around the doctor's neck. "Thank you for helping me find my voice again. Thank you for believing that I could be happy. You did the hard work yourself, my dear. I just provided a little guidance along the way." The ride back to Cottonwood Range passed in comfortable conversation as they discussed plans for the celebration Rosa had been preparing all week. The ranch hands had been given the evening off, neighbors had been invited to share in their joy, and Rosa had been cooking for days to ensure everyone would be properly fed. But for Mercy, the most important moment came when they crested the hill that revealed the ranch spread out below them. The Cottonwood Ranch gate stood open in welcome, its carved sign now reading McCrae, Cottonwood Range, home of Silas and Mercy, after Buck had quietly added her name the night before. "Look, Papa," Mercy said, pointing toward the house where lanterns already glowed in the windows and smoke rose peacefully from the chimney. "It looks just like my drawings." "Better than your drawings," Silas corrected gently, "because this is real and it's ours, and it always will be." The celebration that evening filled the house with laughter and warmth that hadn't been heard since Sarah and Thomas were alive. Neighbors who had initially been skeptical of Silas's decision to take in the auction girl now spoke glowingly of Mercy's artistic talents and sweet nature. Children from neighboring ranches played games in the parlor, while adults shared stories and refreshments in the kitchen. Reverend Morrison offered a blessing over the newly official family, his words carrying the weight of community approval and divine recognition. "Lord, we thank you for bringing this child to safety and for opening Silas's heart to love again. May this family know your protection and guidance in all the years to come." But it was Mrs. Henley, the church's moral authority, who provided the evening's most touching moment when she presented Mercy with a gift that left everyone speechless. "I've been working on this since Christmas," she announced, unwrapping a beautiful quilt that told the story of Mercy's journey to Cottonwood Range. The fabric pieces had been carefully chosen and stitched to show scenes from her life. The auction where Silas saved her, her first drawings, Christmas morning with her new family, and finally, the courthouse where her adoption was made official. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," Mercy whispered, running her fingers over the intricate stitching. "Thank you, Mrs. Henley. I'll treasure it always. Every young lady needs a proper quilt for her bed." "Mrs. Henley replied, though her gruff voice couldn't hide the emotion behind her words. "This one tells your story, child, your real story, about finding love and family where you least expected it." As the evening wound down and neighbors began the journey back to their own homes, Mercy and Silas found themselves alone on the front porch, watching the stars emerge over the Montana landscape. The wooden horse he had carved for her sat on the porch rail beside them, a reminder of all the simple pleasures that filled their days now. "Papa," Mercy said softly, "do you think Mama and Papa can see us from heaven? Do you think they know I'm safe and happy?" "I think they know," Silas replied, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "I think they're grateful that you found your way to people who love you. And I think they're proud of the brave, strong, beautiful young lady you've become." Mercy leaned against his side, comfortable in the silence that had once been their greatest barrier, but now represented perfect understanding. In her lap, she held her latest drawing, a family portrait, showing herself and Silas on the ranch porch, surrounded by all the people who had helped them build their life together. At the bottom of the drawing, in handwriting that had grown confident and clear over the months of healing, she had written, "Forever family, Papa Silas and Mercy McCrae, Cottonwood Range, home." As the Montana sky filled with stars and a gentle breeze carried the scent of prairie grass and wildflowers, father and daughter sat together in the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new challenges, and new joys, but tonight they were simply a family, complete and content, watching over the land they would tend together for all the years to come. The auction block, where their story began, was nothing but a memory now, replaced by adoption papers and a love that had grown stronger than blood, deeper than law, and more enduring than any force that had tried to tear them apart. In the end, home had found them both.